On the morning of October 25th, 1415, the flower of French chivalry rode toward a narrow strip of muddy farmland in northern France, their armor gleaming like rivers of silver beneath the autumn sky. Behind them, an army of over 20,000 men stretched across the horizon, banners rippling with the fleur-de-lis, confident that by nightfall, the English king would be in chains. Ahead of them stood a ragged band of starving archers. Fewer than 6,000 souls, sick with dysentery, barefoot and trembling in the cold dawn. Men who had marched 260 miles through hostile territory, surviving on scraps and prayers. But in their hands, they held the most deadly weapon medieval Europe had ever known. Then the French advanced, and the sky turned black. Arrows fell like a storm of iron rain. Horses screamed, knights crumpled in the mud. The thunder of hooves became the thunder of men drowning in their own armor, pressed so tightly together they could not swing their swords, could not lift their visors, could not breathe. The earth itself became a weapon, swallowing knights who had spent their entire lives preparing for glory. By noon, the field had become a grave. Thousands of armored corpses lay piled 3 deep in the churned brown earth. Banners of dukes and counts lay trampled beneath the fallen. And rising above the carnage, the Red Cross of England still flew. When the last French charge collapsed, when the screaming finally stopped and only the wind remained, the greatest army France had ever assembled lay destroyed. And a starving English king, his crown dented from battle, stood victorious over a kingdom that had mocked him. That day would echo through centuries. It would become legend, immortalized in poetry and plays, whispered by soldiers on the eve of their own desperate battles. The day when a handful of yeomen with wooden bows broke the spine of medieval chivalry. The day called Agincourt. The road to that blood-soaked field began months earlier, in a world fractured by war. For nearly 80 years, the 100 Years' War had raged between England and France, a conflict born from a disputed crown and fueled by generations of hatred. Kings had risen and fallen, armies had clashed across the fields of Crécy and Poitiers, where English longbows had already proven their devastating power against French cavalry. Yet, France remained unconquered, and the English claim to its throne remained just that, a claim written in ink and defended with blood. In 1413, a new king ascended the English throne. Henry of Monmouth, just 25 years old, inherited a kingdom that had grown cynical about French adventures. His father had seized the crown from Richard II, and whispers of illegitimacy followed the young Henry like a shadow. To silence those whispers, to unite his fractured nobility, and to prove that God favored his house, Henry needed a victory so decisive that no man could question his right to rule. He needed France. The negotiations that followed were theater. Henry demanded the French crown, in vast territories, and a princess for his bride. The French offered scraps and insults. Some chronicles speak of a gift of tennis balls sent by the French Dauphin, a mocking suggestion that the young English king should stay home and play games. Whether true or legend, the message was clear. France did not fear Henry. France would soon learn otherwise. By the summer of 1415, preparations consumed England. Blacksmiths hammered through sleepless nights, forging arrowheads by the tens of thousands. The Tower of London became a factory of war, its storerooms filling with sheaves of arrows, each one capable of punching through plate armor at close range. Ships were commandeered along every port. Soldiers gathered from every shire, yeomen and peasants who had trained with the longbow since childhood. Men who could send 6 arrows into the sky before the first one struck the ground. England was building an army unlike any it had fielded before. On August 13th, 1415, Henry's fleet landed at Cheffonceaux near the mouth of the Seine. His army numbered around 12,000 men, a formidable force but hardly overwhelming. His target was Harfleur, a strategic port that would give England a foothold in Normandy. Henry expected a quick siege, a rapid victory, and then a march toward greater glory. Instead, he found a stubborn garrison and walls that refused to fall. The siege of Harfleur lasted 5 brutal weeks. The English guns pounded the walls day and night, but the defenders fought with desperate courage. Worse than the French resistance was an invisible enemy that crept through the English camp. Dysentery, the bloody flux, spread through the ranks like wildfire. Men who had crossed the channel eager for battle now lay doubled over in their tents, their guts torn apart by disease. Hundreds died without ever seeing a French soldier. Hundreds more were invalided home, their campaign over before it truly began. When Harfleur finally surrendered on September 22nd, Henry had won his prize but lost his army. Of the 12,000 men who had landed in August, barely 9,000 remained fit to fight. Many of those were weak, sick and exhausted. His advisors urged caution. Return to England by sea, they counseled. Rebuild. Try again next year. But Henry saw a different path. He would march north to Calais, the English stronghold on the French coast, a distance of over 160 miles through enemy territory. It was a gesture of defiance, a challenge thrown in the face of France. If the French wanted to stop him, let them come. Henry believed God walked with England. Now he would prove it. The march that followed became an odyssey of suffering. The English army left Harfleur on October 8th, expecting to reach Calais in 8 days. They carried only enough food for that journey, trusting in speed and providence. But the French had other plans. Every bridge was destroyed, every ford was guarded. The countryside had been stripped bare, leaving nothing for the invaders to forage. The army was forced to detour inland, marching south along the Somme River, searching desperately for a crossing, while French forces shadowed their every move. Days turned to weeks. The food ran out. Men ate rotten meat and drank from muddy streams. Dysentery continued its grim harvest. The rain fell without mercy, turning roads to rivers of mud that sucked at boots and dragged at carts. Soldiers who had begun the march in armor now stumbled forward, barefoot, their shoes rotted away, their bodies racked by fever and hunger. Some chronicles record that many archers had to cut away their breeches entirely, their bowels so weakened by disease that dignity had become a luxury they could not afford. And still they marched. Still they carried their longbows, those great wooden weapons, taller than the men who wielded them, crafted from English yew and capable of launching arrows that could kill at 250 yards. The archers were peasants, yeomen, common folk who would never be honored in the songs of chivalry. Yet they were the deadliest soldiers in Christendom. They had trained since childhood, their fingers calloused, their shoulders twisted by years of drawing the powerful bows. Each man carried 24 arrows, and each arrow was tipped with a bodkin point designed to punch through the finest steel. On October 24th, the English army finally crossed the Somme near Péronne and turned north toward Calais. They had covered over 260 miles in 17 days. Salvation seemed close. But that afternoon, scouts returned with news that froze the blood. A French army was blocking the road ahead, and it was enormous. Henry rode forward to see for himself. What he witnessed must have tested even his unshakable faith. Spread across the fields near the village of Agincourt, a host of at least 20,000 Frenchmen had assembled. Some estimates placed the number far higher. These were not peasant levies, but the elite of French nobility, knights encased in the finest plate armor money could buy, their horses caparisoned in silk and steel, their retinues stretching back as far as the eye could see. The Constable of France, Charles d'Albret, commanded the army. 3 dukes, 9 counts, 90 barons. The entire military leadership of a kingdom had gathered for this moment. Against them stood fewer than 6,000 ragged Englishmen.
Steady on, men.
That night, the two armies camped within sight of each other. The French camp blazed with light and noise. Knights feasted and gambled for the ransoms they expected to collect. They argued over who would have the honor of capturing the English king. Some even rolled dice for the prisoners they had not yet taken. Their confidence was absolute. Tomorrow would be a slaughter. The English camp was silent. Henry had ordered that no man speak above a whisper, on pain of losing an ear. The archers huddled in the cold rain, sharpening their stakes and checking their arrows. Priests moved among them, hearing confessions and offering what comfort they could. Every man knew the odds. Every man had seen the size of the army that awaited them at dawn. Henry himself walked among his soldiers. He wore no crown, carried no banner of state. He spoke quietly to his men, not of glory or conquest, but of duty and faith. He told them that they would fight for England, for their families, for each other. He reminded them of what they had already survived, and he made them a promise. Those who lived through tomorrow would be remembered forever. They would be brothers, bonded by blood and fire. They would stand as equals with the greatest lords of England, because they had stood together on this field. Whether the words Shakespeare later gave to Henry were truly spoken that night, no one can say, but the spirit was real. By dawn, the starving, sick and exhausted English army was ready to fight. October 25th, 1415, the Feast of St. Crispin. The morning broke cold and grey, the sky heavy with the promise of more rain. Both armies formed for battle on a narrow strip of farmland between two dense woodlands. The field was perhaps 1,000 yards wide, recently ploughed, and saturated from weeks of rainfall. The mud was thick enough to swallow a man's leg to the knee. Henry positioned his army with care. He had studied the great English victories of the past at Crécy and Poitiers, and he knew that the longbow was supreme in defense. His men-at-arms, only 800 or 900 strong, formed the center of the line. On either side, the archers arranged themselves in wedge formations, each man protected by a sharpened wooden stake driven into the ground at an angle. These stakes would break any cavalry charge, turning horses into impaled, screaming obstacles. The French array was magnificent and terrible. Their vanguard alone contained nearly 5,000 men-at-arms, armored head to toe in gleaming plate. Many of them dismounted to avoid the fate that had befallen cavalry at Crécy. Behind them, rank after rank of knights and soldiers stretched back across the field, their banners a forest of color against the grey sky. Cavalry waited on the flanks, ready to sweep around and destroy the English archers. But the very size of the French army became its weakness. The narrow field forced them to compress their ranks. Men who should have stood arm's length apart found themselves pressed shoulder to shoulder. The cavalry wings had no room to maneuver. The crossbowmen and archers who should have softened the English lines were pushed to the rear, unable to shoot over the heads of their own knights. The experienced commanders, d'Albret and Marshal Boucicaut, urged caution. Wait, they counseled. Let the English attack. Let hunger and disease do the work for us. But the young nobles would not listen. They had come for glory. They had come to crush the English upstart who dared to claim their king's crown. They would not hide behind caution when victory stood within reach. For hours, the two armies faced each other across the muddy field. The French waited for the English to advance into the killing ground. The English waited for the French to charge into their arrows. The tension stretched like a bowstring drawn to its limit. Then Henry made his decision. If the French would not come to him, he would go to them. At around 11 in the morning, he ordered his army to advance. The archers pulled their stakes from the ground. He marched forward and planted them again, closer to the enemy. They were now within killing range, just over 200 yards from the French lines. And then they loosed. The first volley rose into the grey sky, 5,000 arrows climbing in a dark arc before plunging down upon the French. The sound was unlike anything the world had heard. A whistling roar that became a thunderclap of iron striking steel, wood, flesh. Men screamed, horses reared. The second volley was already in the air before the first had landed, and the third, and the fourth. Each archer could loose 10 to 12 arrows per minute. Within 60 seconds, 50,000 arrows had fallen upon the French army. The cavalry broke first, goaded beyond endurance by the storm of arrows. The horsemen on the flanks charged without orders. They thundered across the churning mud toward the English archers, lances lowered, certain they would sweep the peasant bowmen from the field. But the mud dragged at their horses' legs. The arrows never stopped falling. Men and beasts crashed down, tripped over their own dead, impaled themselves on the sharpened stakes. The survivors who reached the English lines found not cowering peasants, but hardened killers who dropped their bows and drew swords, axes and lead mallets, swarming over the unhorsed knights and beating them to death in the mire. The French vanguard advanced on foot, a wall of armored men trudging through mud that reached their knees. Arrows fell upon them in sheets. Some found gaps in armor, piercing throats and armpits and the vulnerable spots behind knees. Others struck with such force that they dented plate and knocked men from their feet. Those who fell could not rise. The weight of their armor pressed them into the mud, and the men behind them stumbled over their bodies or simply walked upon them. By the time the French reached the English line, they were exhausted. They had fought the mud, fought the arrows, and fought their own comrades for space. And now they had to fight men who had been killing them for the last 200 yards. The melee that followed was the stuff of nightmares. The narrow field compressed the French into an ever tighter mass. Men could not swing their swords. Men could not raise their arms. Men could not breathe inside their helmets, the air hot and thick with the stench of blood and fear. The English archers abandoned their bows entirely and waded into the chaos with hammers and hatchets, weapons designed to crush armor and crack skulls. They aimed for visors, for joints, for any gap where steel could find flesh. The Duke of Alençon led a desperate charge toward Henry himself, hoping that killing the English king would end the battle. He struck down the Duke of Gloucester, Henry's own brother, but the king rushed to his siblings' defense. The fighting around Henry became a whirlwind of steel. A blow struck his helmet so hard that part of his golden crown was shattered. But he did not fall. He did not flee. He fought in the mud alongside his men, killing and bleeding like any common soldier. Alençon was cut down. D'Albret, the Constable of France, died in the crush. Dukes and counts and barons fell by the score, not in glorious single combat, but trampled, suffocated, beaten to death by peasants they had never considered worthy opponents. The second French line pushed forward into the carnage, only to become trapped in the same deadly compression. Bodies piled 3 deep, men drowned in mud. The screams of the dying mixed with the crash of weapons until no single sound could be distinguished from the roar of slaughter. And then came a moment that would haunt Henry for the rest of his days. A commotion erupted behind the English lines. A band of French peasants, led by local lords, had attacked the English baggage train and was plundering the camp. In the chaos of battle, Henry could not know if this was a raid or a coordinated assault. He could not know if the remaining French reserves were about to strike his rear, while thousands of prisoners stood in his midst, capable of taking up arms again. He made a terrible choice. He ordered the prisoners killed. The slaughter that followed was brief and merciless. Knights who had surrendered, who had expected to be ransomed according to the codes of chivalry, were cut down where they stood. Some estimates placed the number of murdered prisoners as high as 2,000. It was a war crime by any standard, then or now. But in that moment, with his army outnumbered and his position uncertain, Henry believed he had no choice. The French third line, seeing the carnage before them and the ruthlessness of the English, did not advance. They melted from the field, their courage broken by the horror of what they had witnessed. By early afternoon, the battle was over. The rain returned as the English walked among the fallen. The scale of destruction defied comprehension. Over 6,000 Frenchmen lay dead, including 3 dukes, 9 counts, 90 barons, and the Constable of France. An entire generation of French nobility had been extinguished in a single afternoon. English losses numbered perhaps 400. The Duke of York had died, trampled in the melee. The young Earl of Suffolk fell as well, but these were almost the only notable English deaths in a battle that had destroyed an army. Henry knelt in the mud and gave thanks to God. He ordered that no man boast of the victory, for it belonged not to English arms, but to divine providence. Whether this was genuine humility or calculated piety, the effect was the same. Agincourt became a miracle, proof that God favored the English cause and the English king. The army resumed its march to Calais. They carried their wounded, their prisoners, and their glory. Behind them, the crows descended upon the field, and the village of Azincourt became a charnel house that would take months to clear. When Henry returned to England in November, London erupted in celebration. The procession that greeted him was the most magnificent the city had ever seen. Choirs sang hymns of victory. Banners proclaimed Henry as the champion of Christendom. The Agincourt Carol, composed for the occasion, would be sung for centuries. The consequences of the battle reshaped Europe. Within 5 years, Henry had conquered Normandy and forced the Treaty of Troyes upon the broken French crown. By its terms, he would marry Princess Catherine, daughter of the mad King Charles VI, and upon Charles's death, Henry would become King of France. The dream that had driven English kings for generations seemed finally within reach, but fate is cruel to those who reach too high. In 1422, just 2 years after his triumph, Henry V died of dysentery at the age of 35. The same disease that had ravaged his army at Harfleur claimed the king himself. His infant son inherited 2 crowns he could not hold. France found new champions, most famously a peasant girl named Joan of Arc, who would turn the tide of war. By 1453, England had lost everything in France except Calais, yet Agincourt endured. Not as a strategic victory, for in the end, it won nothing lasting. It endured as a story, a symbol of what men could achieve when courage outweighed numbers and faith outweighed fear. William Shakespeare would immortalize the battle 2 centuries later, giving Henry words that still echo in the speeches of generals and politicians. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. The longbow too would fade from history. Gunpowder and cannon would make obsolete the weapon that had broken French chivalry. The age of the armored knight would give way to the age of the musket and the pike. But the men who stood in the mud at Agincourt, peasant archers who brought down dukes and counts, represented something that would never entirely disappear. The idea that courage and skill could triumph over wealth and birth. The idea that common men, properly led and properly armed, could change the course of history. Today, the fields near Azincourt are quiet farmland once more. A small museum marks the site. The bones of the fallen have long since mingled with the earth they died upon. But on certain autumn mornings, when the mist lies heavy across the ploughed furrows and the crows wheel overhead, it is easy to imagine the sound of thunder rolling across the centuries. The thunder of arrows, the thunder of falling men, the thunder of a single day that echoed through 600 years and still refuses to be silenced. For on that day, October 25th, 1415, a starving army of Englishmen stood against impossible odds and proved what history has proven time and again: that the size of the army matters less than the fire in its heart, that the weight of armor matters less than the will to fight, and that sometimes, when everything seems lost, a band of brothers can hold the line against the world.